The search had officially been called off at 4:00 p.m. on the second day. In the desolate, frozen expanse of the Yukon Territory, called off was a polite synonym for giving up hope. The blizzard that had swallowed the region was a historic monster, dropping temperatures to 30 degrees below zero and turning the landscape into a swirling white void where direction held no meaning. No adult equipped with survival gear could last 48 hours in those conditions. 4-year-old Leo Anderson, wearing only a padded blue snowsuit and tiny mittens, didn't stand a chance. The sheriff had the agonizing duty of telling Sarah and Mark Anderson that their only child was gone, swallowed by the unforgiving wilderness. The town hall, usually bustling, was filled with a heavy, suffocating silence as the exhausted volunteers warmed their frozen hands, refusing to look the parents in the eye. The narrative was written. It was a tragedy that would haunt the town for a generation, but nature, in its infinite mystery, hadn't read that narrative. On the morning of the third day, the storm broke, leaving behind a glittering, deadly calm. A lone trapper, checking his remote lines miles deeper into the woods than any search party had dared to go, stopped his snowmobile. He wasn't looking for a boy, he was looking for signs of lynx. Instead, he found something that made him rub his eyes, certain the cold was causing hallucinations. Broken into the pristine crust of the deep snow were tracks. 2 sets, moving in tandem. One set belonged to a massive creature, an apex predator whose claws had scarred the ice. Alongside them, almost comically small, were the boot prints of a toddler. They weren't running. They were walking together. The Anderson family had moved to the edge of the Yukon wilderness to escape the noise of the world. Mark and Sarah were both architects who craved a life built on simplicity, wood-fire heat, and the majestic silence of the subarctic forest. For their 4-year-old son, Leo, the backyard wasn't a fenced-in lawn. It was an endless kingdom of towering pines and hidden trails. They were careful people, aware of the dangers of the wild. But the wild has a way of finding the one moment you stop paying attention. It was a Saturday morning, remarkably clear and crisp. The thermometer read 10 degrees, but there was no wind, a rare bluebird day. Mark was splitting birch logs near the shed, and Sarah was inside the cabin, the smell of cinnamon and coffee filling the warm air. Leo was on the porch, his small wooden trucks lined up in a neat row. He was supposed to stay within the clearing, and for 3 years he always had. But a flash of movement at the tree line caught his eye. It was a snowshoe hare, its coat a brilliant camouflaged white. To a 4-year-old, it looked like a living toy. Leo hopped off the porch, his boots crunching softly on the packed snow. "Wait, Bunny," he whispered. The hare hopped into the brush. Leo followed. 10 yards turned into 50. 50 yards turned into a winding trail. Within 5 minutes, the cabin was out of sight. Within 10 minutes, the sky began to bruise. The storm didn't roll in. It descended like a falling curtain. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in an hour, and the bluebird day was erased by a wall of screaming white. By the time Sarah stepped onto the porch to call Leo for lunch, the world was gone. There was only the roar of the wind and the terrifying realization that her son had vanished into the heart of a blizzard that was just beginning. The first hour of the storm was the loudest. For Leo, the world had shrunk to the size of his own blue mittens. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed, a high-pitched whistle that seemed to come from the trees themselves. He tried to remember what his father had told him. If you ever get lost, find a big tree and stay there. But every tree looked the same in the whiteout, and the cold was a physical weight pressing down on his small shoulders. By the time night began to bleed into the blizzard, Leo was no longer crying. He was too tired. His breath came in short, jagged puffs of white mist, and his eyelashes were rimmed with frost. He had found a small depression beneath a massive fallen spruce tree where the snow hadn't yet piled too high. He curled into a ball, his chin tucked into his chest, shivering so violently that his teeth ached. That was when he felt the vibration. It wasn't the wind. It was a rhythmic thumping on the frozen ground, heavy, deliberate, and close. Leo squinted through the swirling snow. A shadow, darker than the night and larger than his father's truck, was moving toward him. At first, he thought it was a boulder that had somehow come to life. Then he saw the steam rising from its snout, and the glint of amber eyes reflecting the dim grey light. It was a grizzly bear, a massive, scarred male that should have been deep in hibernation, but the unseasonable bluebird day had drawn him out, and the sudden storm had caught him between dens. Leo froze. He was a child of the Yukon. He knew what bears were. He knew they were the kings of the forest, and he knew they were dangerous. But as the bear approached, it didn't stand on its hind legs or roar. It stopped 5 feet away, its head low to the ground. It let out a long, wet huff of air, a sound that smelled of old pine needles and wild earth. The bear moved closer, its massive paws crunching the ice. Leo closed his eyes, waiting for the end. Instead, he felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of heat. The bear didn't bite. It didn't strike. With the delicacy of a mother cat moving a kitten, the giant animal used its snout to nudge Leo deeper into the hollow of the spruce tree. Then, the unthinkable happened. The predator, a creature that could crush a skull with a single swipe, turned its body and slumped down beside the boy. It leaned its massive, furry flank against the child, creating a wall of heat that blocked the freezing wind. Leo, delirious with cold and driven by a primal need for warmth, did the only thing his survival instinct suggested. He reached out and buried his tiny, frozen hands into the thick, coarse fur of the bear's side. The bear let out another low grunt, shifted its weight to better shield the boy, and settled into the snow. In the heart of the deadliest storm of the decade, the most dangerous creature in the forest had become a living furnace for a dying child. The morning brought no sun, only a flat grey light that filtered through the skeletal branches of the spruce. When Leo opened his eyes, he wasn't met with the sterile white walls of his bedroom. Instead, he saw a wall of dark, coarse hair. For a moment he panicked, his breath hitching in his throat, but then he felt the deep, rhythmic thrumming of the bear's heartbeat against his back. It was like leaning against the engine of an idling tractor, warm, steady, and strangely comforting. The bear, a massive creature the locals later estimated to be over 800 pounds, didn't move. It remained curled in a tight semicircle around the boy, its hot breath melting the frost that had gathered on the spruce needles above them. Leo's fingers were stiff, and his stomach was a hollow ache of hunger, but he was alive. The mountain of fur had kept the frostbite from claiming his limbs during the darkest hours of the night. "Big dog?" Leo whispered, his voice small and raspy. The grizzly's ear twitched. It turned its massive head, its wet black nose inches from Leo's face. In the wild, this was the moment of the kill. But the bear simply let out a long huff and began to lick the frozen condensation off Leo's cheeks with a tongue as rough as sandpaper. It wasn't an act of predation, it was an act of grooming, a behavior usually reserved for a cub. By noon, the blizzard had settled into a steady, heavy snowfall. The bear stood up, shaking its coat and sending a spray of ice crystals into the air. Leo let out a small cry, thinking his protector was leaving him to the cold. He stood up on wobbly legs, his blue snowsuit crusted with ice. "Wait! Don't go!" The grizzly stopped. It looked back at the small human, its intelligent eyes scanning the white void. Then it did something that defied every rule of biology. It didn't walk away. It stepped toward Leo and gently nudged his shoulder with its snout, pushing him forward. When Leo stumbled into the deep snow, the bear didn't keep going. It waited. It walked ahead, its massive weight tamping down the powder, creating a firm, packed trail for the boy's tiny boots to follow. They moved like a bizarre parade through the frozen cathedral of the Yukon. The bear would clear 20 yards of path, then stop and wait for Leo to catch up, often letting the boy lean against its massive legs to rest. The predator was no longer hunting. It was guiding. It was leading him away from the deep, treacherous ravines and toward the lower elevations where the wind didn't bite quite so hard. As the second night approached, the search parties miles away were folding up their maps, their faces etched with the grim reality of a recovery mission. They were looking for a body in the snow. They never expected to find a miracle walking on 4 legs and 2. I'm sitting here, weaving this story for you, and I can't help but feel a little lump in my throat. There's something so beautiful about the idea that, even in the coldest, scariest moments, we aren't as alone as we think. Whether it's a massive grizzly or just a kind word from a stranger, there's always a light. If you're feeling this story as much as I am, I'd love for you to stay a while. You're not just a viewer to me, you're part of a small group of people who still believe in the magic of the world. Click that subscribe button so we can keep finding these miracles together. And tell me, have you ever felt a connection with an animal that you couldn't quite explain? I'd truly love to read your stories in the comments. It's what makes this whole thing feel real. The third morning broke with a cruel, shimmering beauty. The sky was a hard, crystalline blue, and the fresh snow acted like a million mirrors, reflecting a sun that provided light, but no heat. Sheriff Miller and Mark Anderson stood by the command post snowmobiles, their faces haggard, eyes bloodshot from exhaustion and grief. They were preparing for the grim sweep, the search for a body. "Mark, you don't have to be out here for this part," the sheriff said gently, his voice cracking from the cold. "He's my son, Jim," Mark replied, his voice a ghost of its former self. "I'm not leaving him out there alone." They set off, the roar of the engines muffled by the thick, fresh powder. They were 5 miles deep into the valley when the sheriff suddenly raised his hand, signaling a halt. He pulled his binoculars from his heavy coat, his breath hitching. "Movement," he whispered. "At the edge of the clearing, by the old ridge." Mark grabbed his own binoculars, his hands shaking so violently he could hardly focus. When the image finally sharpened, his heart stopped. He didn't see a boy. He saw a massive grizzly bear, a dark titan against the blinding white snow. "Get the rifle," Mark hissed, the primal instinct to protect surging through him. "It's near him. I see a flash of blue." But the sheriff grabbed Mark's arm, his grip like iron. "Wait, Mark. Look closer. Just look." Through the lenses, the scene defied everything they knew about the natural world. The bear wasn't stalking. It wasn't hovering over a kill. It was walking slowly, pausing every few feet. And there, emerging from behind the bear's massive flank, was a tiny, stumbling figure in a bright blue snowsuit. Leo was holding onto the long, coarse fur of the bear's thigh, using the animal as a living crutch. Every time the boy stumbled, the bear would stop and wait, nudging him back to his feet with a snout that could have crushed his ribs. They were moving in a strange, silent harmony, a predator and a child, bound by a pact made in the heart of the storm. "My God," the sheriff breathed. He's bringing him to us." The bear stopped at the edge of the clearing, about 50 yards from the search party. It stood tall, its massive head swinging slowly as it scented the air, catching the smell of gasoline and humans. It let out a low, vibrating huff. Leo let go of the fur. He looked up at the bear, his small hand reaching out to pat the creature's wet, black nose. The bear didn't flinch. It leaned down, gave the boy one final rough lick across his forehead, and then turned. With a power that made the ground seem to tremble, the grizzly lumbered back toward the deep timber, disappearing into the shadows of the pines as if it had never been there at all. Mark didn't wait. He sprinted through the waist-deep snow, screaming his son's name. When he finally reached Leo, the boy wasn't crying. He was shivering, his face red from the cold, but his eyes were bright. "Daddy," Leo whispered as Mark scooped him up, sobbing into the boy's frozen snowsuit. The big dog. He was warm. He let me sleep in his coat. The story of the bear boy of the Yukon didn't just make local headlines. It became a global phenomenon. Biologists and animal behaviorists flocked to the Anderson cabin, offering complicated theories about misplaced maternal instincts or predatory confusion caused by unseasonable weather. They poked and prodded at the logic of it, trying to fit a miracle into a spreadsheet. But for Sarah and Mark, no scientific explanation could ever touch the truth of what they had seen through those binoculars. Leo's recovery was nothing short of a medical anomaly. Aside from minor frostbite on 2 toes and a lingering cough, he was perfectly healthy. The doctors were baffled. A child of his age should have succumbed to hypothermia within 6 hours. When they asked Leo how he stayed warm, he would simply smile and talk about the big dog, whose fur smelled like the forest after rain. The Andersons chose to stay in the Yukon. They didn't move back to the city out of fear. Instead, they lived with a new, profound reverence for the wilderness that surrounded them. Every winter, on the anniversary of the storm, Mark leaves a large pile of fresh salmon and berries at the edge of the clearing, not as a bribe, but as a silent thank you to a guardian who would never ask for one. Sometimes, On the coldest nights, when the aurora borealis dances in shades of neon green above the pines, Leo sits by the window. He watches the tree line with a look of quiet recognition. He knows that out there, in the deep shadows where the humans never venture, a massive, scarred grizzly is still roaming. The world may see a monster, a creature of claws and teeth to be feared, but Leo knows better. He knows that even in the harshest, most indifferent corners of the earth, there is a capacity for mercy that defies all reason. Nature, in its terrifying beauty, hadn't just spared him, it had carried him home.